Welcome everyone, I'm Ginny Hallam of Halborns and you're listening to our 10 Minutes With sessions. Halborns are part of the brilliant Empowering People group who supports with tech-enabled people solutions. And part of that support are these 10 Minutes With sessions. This is the first session of our brand new series focusing on what makes a great contract of employment. And we think it's 3 C's: compliance, obviously, commerciality, and a contemporary tone. We've got individual sessions dedicated to each one of those 3 C's, and today we're kicking off with compliance, arguably the most important C, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Stefan Mars, Head of the Halborns team. Hi, Stefan.
Hi, Jenny. Great to be here.
So you've been really busy supporting with our email updates for everybody around employment contracts and what makes a great one. And today you're going to take us through key compliance considerations for those employment contracts. We've got 10 minutes. Should we get started?
Let's do it.
Fantastic. Okay, so my first question, so let's start with a broader question around compliance and why it's important. Obviously, we comply because the law tells us that we have to, but what if we get it wrong? What are the consequences?
Okay, so the main issue from an employer's point of view is potentially if you have a non-compliant contract, you are facing a claim for each and every employee for up to 4 weeks' pay. So obviously, a claim for 4 weeks' pay from every employee can get quite expensive very quickly. So we'd obviously recommend that if you do have a non-compliant contract, and we'll come on to that, that you issue new ones as soon as possible to avoid any issues. But there's also obviously a wider issue in that if you don't have a comprehensive contract in place, then you won't be protected in terms of setting out all the important terms, and you're at risk of terms being implied into the contract by custom and practice. That's much less of an issue where you've got a fully compliant contract for 2 reasons. Firstly, an implied term can't override an express term. And also, if you've got a fully comprehensive contract in place, you'll have what's called an entire agreement clause in there, which means that the only terms that apply to the employment relationship are set out in the contract itself.
Fantastic. Really helpful just to get that wider context on why this is important. And so moving on from then, the consequences of getting it wrong, can you help us with the kind of key obligations on employers in respect of compliance and what it is that we need to do to make sure that we're complying?
Absolutely. So until a few years ago, you used to have 2 months to issue new employees with contracts of employment. So that changed in 2020, and you've now got you've got to give a contract to an employee on or before their first day, and we'd obviously recommend that you do it before their first day. And the contract has to set out a number of basic terms that are included in the Employment Rights Act 1996. So all of the things that you'd expect in terms of things like the employer's name and address, normal place of work, salary, days and hours of work, notice, sick pay, holiday entitlement, etc. As well as the legal compliance angle, on a practical level, we'd be recommending for years that that employers give employees the contract on or before their first day. Basically, because you're in a much better bargaining position as an employer if you say to the employee, you don't start work until you sign this contract. Once the employee started work, as well as the compliance angle that we talked about, it's much more difficult to get them to sign that contract if you haven't made starting work conditional upon them signing a contract. So obviously, as we mentioned a minute ago, a really good idea to have all the terms really clearly laid out in the contract and signed on or before day one, just to avoid any arguments about what the terms of the contract are.
Okay, fantastic. And obviously we know that core compliance has existed since the Employment Rights Act 1996, but you've just mentioned a new law in 2020, and I think that's the good work plan that you're alluding to. What are the additional requirements beyond the compliance points that already existed under the Employment Rights Act 1996 that were introduced by the good work plan as a result of that new piece of legislation?
Sure. So the additional requirements set out in the Good Work Plan came in on the 6th of April 2020 and basically added in some additional things that you as an employer have to include in your contract of employment. So you need to include details of all of the benefits that you offer to your employees, so contractual and non-contractual benefits, so things like staff discount schemes, power allowance, bonus, commission, if you operate toil, so time off in lieu, season ticket loans, cycle to work schemes, etc. All of those things now have to be set out in the contract. You also have to include a statement in relation to whether or not your employees' days and working hours are either variable or not variable. So does the employees' days and hours of work vary from week to week, or are they fixed and they don't change? So you need to set that out as well. You need to include all of the terms in relation to training. So do you require compulsory training, for instance, things like manual handling, health and safety, that kind of thing? You need to set out who pays for that training. Obviously, that's normally the employer, but not always the case. And then you need to set out how it works in terms of training that operates during the employment relationship. So do you think employees will need to do training, or is there ad hoc training that they might need to do from time to time? And also any terms in relation to training cost recovery. So if, for example, you've got an employee, you put an employee through an HGV course or a forklift course, or they do an MBA, are you going to require them to pay back some of all of that cost if they then leave you shortly after leaving the training, having done the training? You also need to include any terms in relation to time off, both paid and unpaid. So all of the usual things in relation to things like maternity, paternity, etc., but also sabbaticals, career breaks, anything like that. So any terms that relate to paid or unpaid time off. You need to include a bit more detail than you used to in relation to probationary periods. So in particular, in relation to extensions to probationary periods. So do you have the right to extend the probationary period? How long will you be extending it by? Whether that's automatic if they're off sick, for example, or only where they're notified, and any changes around the notice period that applies during an employee's probationary period. So all of those things, basically, for new employees that started on or after the 6th of April, they have to be included in their contract from day one. But if you've got longer serving employees who've been with you prior to the 6th of April 2020, you don't have to issue a new contract just to include these things. As and when you update contracts, you do need to include those additional items.
No, super, that's really helpful. So we've just written a paternity policy, haven't we? So for an employer who wants to give their employees some time off where they're getting a new puppy into the house, so something like that benefits. I appreciate that's pretty far out there, but something like that benefit would need to be referenced as a benefit that's being offered. Yeah, fantastic. And I think we decided when we were prepping for this session that we weren't going to write out a long list of the Section 1 provisions that you need to include in every contract to ensure compliance. What we wanted to do is help with some of those key areas that are often missed. So can you take us through what's most common or some of the most common compliance issues that you see when you look at people's contracts, Stefan, of which you've seen a few in your time, haven't you?
I have, yes. So I guess our top 5 missing items would be, first of all, the first date of continuous employment. So not just the date this contract starts, but the date the employee first worked for you. We see that missing quite a lot. And the reason it's important is because a lot of rights in employment law depend on when you started employment with the employer. So it's really important to set that out clearly in the contract when the employee first started work for the business, just to avoid any arguments about that. Whether the employee is required to work outside the UK for a month or more. So that's probably the number one in terms of things that we see missing. It's just one of those things that you have to include under Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act, and we see that missing a lot. Notice periods, so notice periods that don't comply with the statutory minimum requirements, which are basically a week per year of service, capped at 12 years and 12 weeks. So again, notice periods that are not complying with that statutory minimum. The fourth one will be sick pay, so including all of the terms that relate to sick pay. So is the employee just entitled to statutory sick pay? If so, when are the waiting days? So the days on, so usually you only get statutory sick pay from day 4. Which are the days that are going to count to those first 3 days before you're entitled to statutory sick pay? If you offer company sick pay, you need to include all those terms. So is it discretionary, for example, or if it's a contractual entitlement for the employee, setting out when it won't and will be paid. So, for example, if the employee is entitled to a disciplinary process, do they still get company sick pay if they're off sick at that point? And then finally, whether the contract is subject to a collective agreement or not. So again, something that has to be set out based on the Employment Rights Act and something we see missing quite a lot.
Wow, quite a bit then. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that these things do recur on a fairly regular basis. I think sometimes because of a bit of a misconception legally, but also sometimes just simply because actually there's a lack of understanding that you need to express things in the negative as well as the positive. Like, for example, if there's no variability in terms of hours, you have to express that, don't you? Rather than simply saying nothing about it. So yeah, really, really interesting that these things do come up quite so often. So for those watching, perhaps that are thinking that they want a review to be done, and perhaps then they're going to do some redrafting so that they're confident in their contracts. You know, once that's happened, you feel great, don't you? You've got a workable contract, you've got some compliant contracts, you can be confident in giving those contracts out. But that's not where the journey stops, is it, with contracts of employment? They evolve, they have to keep up with a regularly changing workplace. So what would be your kind of thoughts around how frequently you should look at updating contracts of employment, Stefan?
We definitely recommend reviewing once a year. And the reason is that both obviously in relation to the point you made about changes in the workplace itself, but also employment law changes all the time. And at the moment, there's a lot of new employment law coming. So things like unpaid carers leave, some changes to the GDPR, some changes around flexible working. So if you don't review your employment contracts regularly, they can quickly become out of date and non-compliant. So yeah, we definitely recommend once a year. The good news is you don't always have to reissue the whole contract. So it's often the case that you can just issue what's called a side letter. So a straightforward short letter that sets out the changes in terms that you as the employer would sign. You'd get the employee to countersign that document, and then you'd keep that with a copy of their contract of employment, rather than having to reissue every single contract to every single employee.
Okay, fantastic. And for those of you that are watching that are signed up to our email updates, obviously we'll signpost you as to when there are changes that need to be reflected in your contracts of employment. If you're not already signed up to email updates, then our contact details are at the end of this session. Please do contact us and we can make sure that they get sent to you. If you're intelligent employment subscribers, so our intelligent employment service at Halborns, then we will update the template contracts for you and notify you of any changes so that you can then do that easily yourselves without having to invent things, perhaps through your own kind of Google searches, heaven forbid. So fantastic, Stefan. That has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your expertise and insight. That leads us nicely into our brand new contract diagnostic tool, which we've been working hard on and we have launched on our website. So for those watching, if you want to get a free insight into the health of your employment contract, you can use our automated free 10-point diagnostic tool to get a health score. You can access this directly on our website, and you'll also find the link, if you need it, in the video description below. If you're interested in further expert support with a view to looking at your contracts in full and perhaps having a full review or an update or a redraft of your existing contracts, we've got a solution for everyone beyond the diagnostic. So please do get in contact. The details are on the screen. Let us know if you need some help and we'll get in contact with you. We'll get in touch and we can discuss your requirements and recommend the best solution for you to meet with your budget. All that's left for me to say is thank you so much for your time today, Stefan.
Pleasure. I hope everyone found it useful.
Great stuff. And as ever, please do get in touch if you've watched this and we can help at all with supporting with reviews, redrafts, or any updates to your contracts of employment.